Montana Territory, January 1884. The storm came fast, like a hand sweeping across the prairie. And by the time Temperance Holloway realized how bad it was already too late. She had been hauling 2 sacks of split wood from the shed to the stove house when the sky turned white, the air thick with snow and wind so sharp it felt like knives. Her scarf was ripped from her face, her boots sunk deep into a drift, and she staggered backwards, slipping hard enough to knock the breath out of her. When she opened her eyes again, she could not see the barn or the house or her boys. "Troot, Thayer," she screamed, voice torn by the wind. No answer came, only the roar of the blizzard. The wind shoved her sideways, her skirts tangling around her knees. She dropped the wood and ran, heart pounding, trying to find the front porch, the fence post, anything familiar. Snow blinded her. Her fingers went numb. Her legs burned with cold. She tripped over a buried trough and fell hard. Her cheek hit ice. Her hands scrambled at the snow, but she could not push herself up. She was already too cold. "Boys," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Mama's coming." But the whiteness swallowed her. Quinlan Pierce had been riding fence when the storm rolled in. He knew better than to fight against one of Montana's winter tempers, so he turned his gelding around and pushed toward his cabin, low and tucked beneath the ridge. He was halfway there when he spotted something dark in the snow where it should not have been. He dismounted fast, boots crunching through the drifts. It was a woman half buried, not moving. Her dress was frozen, her hands bare and scraped. Her lips were blue. He knelt beside her and touched her cheek. "Miss," her eyelids fluttered. She tried to speak, but the words came out broken and hoarse. He did not waste time. He pulled off his coat, wrapped her in it, and lifted her into his arms. She was light, far too light. He held her close and hurried back to his horse. By the time he made it to the cabin, snow was thick on his shoulders. Inside, he laid her down near the hearth, lit a fire fast as he could, and brought water to boil. He stripped off her wet things with steady hands, wrapped her in dry blankets, and held her close when she started to shiver. He fed her warm broth with a spoon between her trembling lips. "You're safe," he said low. "You hear me? You're safe now." She flinched at first, but then her fingers curled into his shirt. She did not speak. She just held on. 2 days passed before she could stand. Her name was Temperance Holloway. Her husband had died the previous spring from a timber accident. She had 2 sons, Troot and Thayer, ages 6 and 4. She had gone out to fetch wood, and the storm came so fast she never made it back inside. "My boys," she said, voice thick. "They were in the house. I left the fire burning, I swear I did." Quinlan nodded. "Then we will go." She was too weak to ride, so he built a sled and hitched it to his gelding. He wrapped her in furs, tucked hot stones at her feet, and rode with her across the ridge and down into the valley where her homestead lay. What they found was a ruin. The roof had collapsed under the snow. The door was open. Smoke no longer came from the chimney. Temperance's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled from the sled, her legs barely holding her up. She ran, screaming her sons' names. The house was empty. The fire had gone out. The stove was cold. The beds were still warm. Outside, Quinlan found the track's small bootprints heading east toward the tree line. He followed them fast, Temperance close behind him, both of them running now, slipping on the ice, hearts racing. They found the boys in a hollow beneath the trees, curled together under a quilt, faces pale and tear-streaked. "Mama!" Troot's voice cracked as she dropped to her knees and pulled them into her arms. Thayer clung to her, sobbing. "They ran when the wind tore the door open," Quinlan said, crouching beside them. "They must have thought the trees would give them shelter." Temperance kissed their faces, her hands shaking. "You came back," she whispered, holding them tighter. "You came back to me." She looked up at Quinlan then, eyes wide with something new hope. He offered her his hand. "Let us get you home." The cabin was not big, but it was warm. Quinlan gave Temperance the bed, and he slept near the hearth on a blanket. The boys took to him fast, asking questions, watching him chop wood, hanging on his every word when he told stories about wild horses and gold under the mountains. Temperance moved slowly those first few days but grew stronger. She helped with meals, sewed buttons, mended socks. She never complained. At night, she sat beside the fire with her boys, her eyes sometimes far away but her smile soft. One night, after the boys were asleep, she stayed up later. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice quiet. Quinlan looked at her across the firelight. "Because you were out there alone, and no one should be alone in a storm like that," she nodded. "You saved my life." He stood and walked over to her. "You saved theirs. They are good boys, strong." She looked up at him. "They miss their father." "I know." She reached out and touched his hand. "I thought I had lost everything." His fingers curled around hers. "You have not." She looked at him then, really looked. He had a strong jaw, sun-darkened skin, dark hair that curled a little behind his ears. His eyes were steady. "Quinlan," she whispered. He leaned down slowly. When their lips met, it was soft and warm, steady like the fire behind them. Neither of them said a word. But everything changed. By the second week, the snow began to settle, packed hard along the low hollows and brushed thin on the southern faces of the hills. The cabin stayed warm. The boys took to their letters with charcoal on scrap paper, and Temperance found a rhythm in the quiet. Boiling porridge before first light, darning sleeves by oil lamp, listening for the small breathing of her sons at night. She moved through it all with care, not out of fear, but reverence for the narrow path between what was lost and what remained. Quinlan came in from splitting pine, his shoulders dusted with sawdust, mittens stiff with sap. Temperance was peeling turnips at the table, her sleeves rolled to the elbows. She didn't look up. "You always work like someone's watching," he said, setting down his gloves. "I don't know any other way." Her voice was even, but her hands slowed. He sat across from her, careful not to crowd. "You ever have helped before?" She nodded once. "My sister came up from Dakota that first summer, stayed through harvest, then her baby took sick. She hasn't written since." Quinlan didn't push further. He watched her fingers, raw at the knuckles, move steady with the blade. "You ever think of going back east?" he asked. "There's nowhere to go back to." She scraped the peel into a bowl. "My father passed before the war ended. Mama followed not long after, and I buried my husband on the edge of our land under the cottonwood." He let her words settle. "I grew up in Missouri," he said after a time. "My mother was Choctaw, my father wasn't. They kept to themselves mostly. When I was 15, he died hauling freight through Kansas territory. She sold the house and took us west." Temperance looked up. "I never knew you were mixed blood." "Most folks don't," he said. "I don't make much of it, and the land doesn't ask." She studied him for a long moment. "Is it lonely?" "It was," he said. "Until now." The fire cracked behind them. Outside, wind brushed the eaves slow and low. She returned to her peeling, but her eyes lingered on him a breath longer than before. Later, as the boys knelt by the hearth building towers from kindling scraps, Trout turned with a question. "Mr. Pierce, do you know how to make a trap?" Quinlan raised an eyebrow. "What kind of trap?" "For rabbits," Trout said. "Mama says we shouldn't waste bullets." Temperance didn't interrupt, only watched from the rocker, one hand resting on her youngest shoulder. Quinlan nodded. "All right, but you have to promise me something." "What?" "You check at first light. Every day. No animal should suffer long." The boy nodded solemnly. "I promise." Next morning, they ventured out together, the boys bundled in wool, Quinlan carrying a coil of wire and a knife. They returned with flushed cheeks and empty hands, but Trout's eyes shone with pride. Temperance met them at the doorway. "Find anything?" "Not yet," Trout said, "but we made 3 snares." Quinlan met her gaze. "He's got good sense." She let the screen fall shut behind them and turned back to the stove. "He gets that from his father." That night she stayed up after the boys had gone to sleep, folding shirts by lantern light. Quinlan sat at the table, mending a harness strap. "Do you mind?" she asked, motioning to the bench beside him. He gestured for her to sit. "Not at all." She lowered herself slowly, arms folded across her lap. "I used to wonder what it would feel like to not be afraid of needing someone." His stitching paused. "And now, I think I'm starting to understand." He set the leather strip aside. "You were never weak, Temp." Needing isn't the same as being helpless. She met his eyes then. No one's called me Temp in years. I won't if you'd rather I didn't. Her hand brushed his on the table. No, I want you to. There was no kiss, no sudden closeness. Just the quiet weight of shared understanding, thick as the winter air outside. It was enough. The thaw came slow, the way deep winter always softened first in the sound of water under ice, then in the shift of light across the floorboards. By late February, the snow had begun to pull back from the roots of the aspen, revealing patches of yellowed grass and the first stubborn shoots of life pressing through the cold ground. Quinlan saddled Barlow before sunup, the gelding restless with the scent of open earth. Temperance stepped out onto the porch with a shawl over her shoulders, hair still damp from the basin. Her eyes followed his movements, careful and precise as he checked the cinch and reins. "I could ride out with you," she said, voice light but steady. He looked up. "You feel strong enough," she nodded. "I do. I won't ride fast, but I can keep up." He didn't answer right away. Then he gave a small nod and untied the second bridle from the post. They rode east, past the ridge where the wind always broke first, down through the low draw where the creek had started to run again. The boys stayed behind with old Mr. Larue, the trapper who'd taken a liking to their chatter and agreed to watch them for the morning in exchange for bread and lard. Temperance rode astride, skirts hitched to her belt, boots snug in the stirrups. The horse beneath her was borrowed but familiar now. She carried no rifle, no pack, just a knife at her hip and a quiet resolve in her spine. They passed a burned-out homestead, its chimney the only thing standing. She didn't ask whose place it had been. Quinlan didn't offer. "How far have you gone from here?" she asked after a long stretch of silence. "North to Fort Benton once," he said. "Didn't care for the crowds. Mostly I keep to the hills and the valley." "There's enough work and enough quiet." She turned her head. "So you chose this life." "I chose not to chase what didn't suit me." They stopped beside the creek, muddy now with the melt, and dismounted. Temperance crouched to wash her hands in the cold water, her fingers red from the chill, but she didn't flinch. Quinlan pulled a strip of jerky from his coat pocket and handed it to her. "You always this stubborn?" "Only when I need to be," she said, breaking it in half and offering him back a piece. He took it without smiling, but she saw something loosen in his shoulders. She sat on a rock near the bank, watching the water thread through the sedges. "I used to believe in signs," she said. "Dreams, birds, the way the wind moved through a field. What changed? Life kept happening." "Maybe it still is," he said. She looked at him then, the wind lifting strands of her hair across her cheek. "I never asked, do you plan on staying here? I do." "And if I stayed too?" He didn't answer, not with words. He stepped forward and reached for her wrist, his thumb brushing the inside where her pulse beat faintly. She didn't pull away. "You don't have to decide yet," he said. "But if you did, if you wanted, there's room." She let out a breath that didn't shake. "I'd want my boys to have more than survival. They'd have it." He let her go gently. "You would too." They didn't speak again until they were halfway home, the sun warm on their backs, the horses moving easy beneath them. The mountains rose in the west, steady and blue. That night, Troot crawled into her lap without a word and stayed there while the fire burned low. Thayer slept with one arm over his face, mouth open, hair stuck to his forehead. Quinlan stood at the door, arms folded, watching the stillness inside. Temperance looked up at him. "They'll heal," she said softly. He nodded. "So will you." She rose, careful not to wake the boy, and crossed the room. Her hand found his calloused and warm. "You're not just shelter," she said. "You're something else." He leaned close, his lips brushing just above her brow. "So are you." They stood like that for a long while, her breath steady against his chest, the snow beginning to fall again outside, not heavy, not sharp, just soft enough to coat the world in quiet. March brought the sound of dripping eaves and the heavy scent of thawed soil. Temperance stood on the slope behind the cabin, apron pulled tight around her waist, surveying the patch of land Quinlan had cleared for her. The snow had receded enough to show the dark line he'd dug with the spade straight, even. She stepped into the furrow and knelt, pressing her palm into the earth. It was cold, but not frozen. Not anymore. "You'll be wanting seed," Quinlan said behind her. He had a sack slung over one shoulder, his boots caked in mud. "Barley, maybe potatoes if you get them in quick." She rose slowly, brushing her hands on her skirt. "I saved some from last year, not much. I can ask down near the station. There's a man trades for salt pork, could bring some back. I don't want you owing for my land." He shook his head. "It's not a debt if I choose it." She didn't answer right away. "Then I'll trade you preserves once the berries come in." Quinlan smiled, but it was quiet, almost shy. "That'll work." They walked back together, their boots sinking in the soft ground. The boys were out near the creek, building a lean-to from stripped branches. Their laughter carried through the still air, clear and sudden, like birds calling in the trees. That evening, Quinlan carved a length of pine into a spoon, his hands steady as the blade moved. Temperance sat across from him, mending the heel of a boot with waxed thread. "I had a sister," he said, not looking up. "Eloise, 3 years younger. She got caught in the fever one spring down in the Washita country. We buried her in a grove of cottonwoods." Temperance paused in her stitching. "You still think of her?" "Not every day, but when I do, it's always the same picture, her standing barefoot in the mud, hollering at me to slow down." She set aside the boot. "I had a brother, Levy. He never came back from the war. They sent a letter, that was all." "So many gone," he said. "But not all," she said, and reached across the table, her fingers brushing the back of his hand. He turned his palm upward, letting her rest her hand in his. Later, after the boys had curled together on the cot, Quinlan stepped outside to check the sky. The wind had died. Stars blinked low and close. Temperance joined him, arms crossed against the chill. "Do you miss your quiet?" she asked. He looked at her, the way her hair fell loose now, no longer pinned so tight. "No, I don't," she exhaled, a sound small and certain. "I want to stay. You sure?" "I've been sure since the morning you found me. I just didn't know how to say it." He turned toward her. "Say it now." She stepped closer, her breath visible between them. "I want to build something here, not just survive it. I want a life." Quinlan didn't move to touch her, not yet. "With me?" She nodded. "With you?" He leaned in, not fast, but with the kind of gravity that came from knowing what it meant to be alone too long. When he kissed her, it was slow, the kind of kiss that held weight, like planting something deep and trusting it would grow. When they pulled back, she stayed close, her forehead resting against his chest. "I never thought I'd feel this again," she said. "You didn't lose everything, Temp," he murmured. "You just hadn't found the rest yet." She looked up at him, eyes clear. "Then let's find it together." And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like a thing they had to brace against. It felt like something they could build. By April, the road to town was passable again, though still slick in the gullies and soft where the snowmelt had pooled. Quinlan hitched the wagon with care, checking the yoke twice before easing the team forward. Temperance rode beside him, her hands wrapped in her shawl, eyes steady on the horizon. Trout and Thayer sat in the back with a basket of eggs wrapped in straw and a jar of rendered lard for trade. They hadn't been into town since before the winter set in, and even then, only Quinlan had gone. Temperance hadn't stood among neighbors since before her husband's burial, and there'd been little reason to since. But spring had stirred something in her. Not just the need for salt or lamp oil, but the quiet pull of being seen again as she was now. The town of Crow Creek was no more than 3 lanes of buildings bracketed by cottonwood and dust. The general store sat at the center, flanked by a smithy and a feed mill. The church stood farther up the rise, whitewashed and narrow-windowed, the bell silent until Sundays. Temperance stepped down from the wagon with her boys clinging close. Quinlan handed her the basket, his fingers brushing hers. "You want me beside you?" he asked. "I want you near," she answered. Inside the store, old Mrs. Hennessy paused at the sight of them, her ledger open on the counter. She took in the children first, then Temperance's face, and finally Quinlan's presence behind her. Her lips parted, but she said nothing. Just nodded once and reached for her scale. Temperance traded the eggs for flour and vinegar, the lard for sugar and a tin of cocoa. The coins she offered were taken without comment. She'd kept them wrapped in oilcloth all winter. Outside, Thayer tugged on Quinlan's duster as they walked toward the wagon. "Can we see the train?" he asked, pointing toward the far end of the town where the tracks ran beside the river. Quinlan looked to Temperance. "We've time." They walked the boys down to the edge of the platform where two men were stacking crates into the freight car. No train yet, just the iron rails stretching west and east, humming faintly beneath their boots. Trute leaned into his mother's side. "Will we ever ride it?" Temperance ran her hand over his hair. "Maybe one day, if we want to see something new." Quinlan crouched beside the boys. "You know what it takes to ride far on a train." "What?" Thayer asked. "Trust. You have to trust the tracks'll hold and the engine'll carry you where you mean to go." Trute blinked. "But you can't see the end of the track." "That's the point," Quinlan said on the way home. Temperance held the reins. Quinlan let her, resting his hand lightly on her shoulder when the wagon jostled over a rut. "You ever think you'd come back into town?" he asked. "I used to think I wouldn't belong again," she said. "But I didn't feel that today." He didn't speak, just let the silence stretch with the rhythm of the wheels. That night, after the boys were asleep, she stood by the window, watching the moon rise above the pines. "You ever miss the old life?" she asked. Quinlan set down the tin cup he'd been drinking from. "Not lately." "I don't either," she said. "But sometimes I feel like I owe it something, for making me strong enough to survive it." "You don't owe it, you built from it," she turned to him. "Do you think they'd be proud?" "The ones who came before," he stood and crossed to her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. "They'd see what you've done with what they left. I'd reckon they'd be proud." She leaned back into him. "I've never felt this safe." "You are," he said. "With me, you are." She turned in his arms and lifted her face to his. The kiss was sure this time, not tentative like before, but rooted. In the following weeks, the garden took shape. Quinlan built a simple fence with rails he split himself. Temperance taught Trute how to set onion bulbs deep and straight. Thayer followed her with a bucket of water and asked endless questions about worms and roots. They planted together, side by side, without hurry. One evening, Trute pulled Quinlan aside while the sun dipped low. "Are you gonna marry Mama?" Quinlan met his eyes. "Would that be all right with you?" The boy nodded. "I think she'd be happier." Quinlan's mouth set in a line. "I think you're right." He asked her 3 days later in the middle of hanging a new door on the smokehouse. She was holding the hinges steady, her hair tied back with twine when he said it. "I want to build all of this with you, not just fences and beds, a life, a home." She looked up, eyes soft. "You already have." He held out a simple silver ring. "Then say yes." She took it in one hand and reached for his with the other. Yes. They married in the clearing behind the cabin under the early bloom of wild plum. Mrs. Hennessy brought a cake. Mr. LaRue stood witness. The boys wore their cleanest shirts and grinned the whole day. The ceremony was short. The vows were spoken without grandness but with deep, steady meaning. When Quinlan kissed her, the wind quieted as if the land itself paused to listen. That night, after the lantern had been turned low and the fire banked, Temperance lay beside him beneath the quilt she'd stitched herself. "I never thought I'd be loved again," she whispered. He ran his hand through her hair, slow and sure. "You're not just loved. You're home." The cabin held them in its quiet warmth, the boys asleep in the next room, the garden planted, the hills watching. And in the soft dark, their fingers laced together, they slept in peace, knowing come morning the world would wait for them together.